Good afternoon, everybody. Great to see you all. Thank you for joining this virtual conference that's been organised by our good friends at Witherslack group. Really pleased to be able to join you this afternoon. And actually talking about something that we've never really done before on one of our Witherslack webinars, and that's talking about sexuality and neurodiversity. And it's an interesting subject for lots of different reasons, because there is also a lot of really interesting research about prevalence of neurodiversity in the LGBT community. And also, I think a lot of concerns as well for parents, because your generation, my generation, we had a very different kind of upbringing, didn't we, to the world that our young people live in now. The world has changed so much and seems to be changing so much quicker. And young people are changing, and the world that we live in is changing. And I think one of the wonderful things about young people today is they are so much more embracing and accepting of diversity in every sense of the word. You know, children have no care at all, and see anybody whose skin color is different, whose sexual orientation is different. They are much more embracing and accepting of neurodiversity. When I was at school, you know, the so-called special needs kids were in a porter cabin behind the sports hall, and you know, in every sense of the word, were made to feel that they didn't really belong in that school. And that was communicated to all the other young people in the school, that the special needs kids weren't like us. They were over there. They didn't really belong here. We taught in a certain way, so you had to learn in a certain way. And if you weren't achieving and you weren't making progress, it was either because you weren't very bright, or you weren't trying, or you were lazy. There was never that question of, well, what do we all need to do to adapt our schools so that they're welcoming, enabling, and facilitate learning for every young person in there? Because we used to make these assumptions, didn't we, that if you had dyslexia or dyspraxia or ADHD or autism, that you were somehow less intelligent. And we all know that that's absolutely not true. And the research is telling us that we know that there are lots of very academically and intelligent, successful people with ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, just in every profession. They're all there, hiding in plain sight. We don't see them. Why? Because when we were all at school, we were all led to believe that the children in the special needs class, they're not successful. They're not intelligent. They don't fit in. They're not like us. And for anybody who's had that experience of education, we know what it's like to feel isolated, to feel that we don't belong in that space. Add to that sense of isolation, perhaps having some concerns about your sexual orientation and your emergent sexuality. So that's what we're going to look at today. What I would like to say, though, is if anybody's got any questions, please put them in the chat box. Please don't mention your child by name, or in any way where they might be able to be identified, and we'll try and come to those questions later on. So let's just have a quick recap. What do we mean by neurodiversity? Fundamentally, what we're saying is that we know that 1 in 10 people are dyslexic, 1 in 67 autistic, 1 in 20 ADHD, 1 in 10 dyspraxic, 1 in 10 dyscalculia, 1 in 100 tics and Tourette's. But we know a lot of children, autism and ADHD, can experience tics at some point in their lives, and they'll go. I know that I did between the ages of 14 and 17. But if you think about those numbers, you know, in our school registers, it says, doesn't it, in mainstream schools, 15%. And that's all children with special educational needs and disabilities, physical disabilities, as well as learning differences. But if you think that at least 1 in 10 people are dyslexic, then in truth, these different neurotypes of dyslexia, autism, ADHD, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, 1 in 5, at least 1 in 5 human beings on this planet of 7.5 billion people have one of these different minds. Human beings have been evolving for over 200,000 years. We only started using the written word about 7,000 years ago. So those dyslexic minds that have been around since the beginning of time, were they somehow less than before we invented the word? The context we're in is often what impairs us or excludes us. And in a neurodiverse paradigm, what we're saying is, hang on a second. If there are 7.5 billion people on this planet, no one looks the same, no one sounds the same, and everybody's brain is as unique as their fingerprints, then there must be an evolutionary reason why. That this is the universal design, that you have this difference of human thinking. And why is that? Because as one of the most successful species on this planet, we have learned to adapt our environment to suit our needs. In other words, we've adapted the context so we can thrive. And actually, from an evolutionary perspective, what we call epigenetically, our DNA has changed and adapted so that we can thrive in these different environments. In other words, neurodiversity is a natural expression of this diversity that exists within humankind, that we're not errors of genetics, we're not disordered, we are simply different. And neurodiversity does not mean low IQ, it means that your brain works and processes information in a different way. So the language of neurodiversity is strength-based, whereas the language of special educational needs is deficit-based, isn't it? It's about what you can't do, what you're not able to do. And it is a real tragedy, isn't it, that so many of our children go through school being told that they're either lazy or they're not able, when in fact, we're not helping them understand themselves, which is absolutely integral to who we are as human beings, and we're not helping them to understand how to learn. We're so focused on what they have to learn and how we measure it in exams. So neurodiversity is really quite now well established in industry, and is really only beginning to happen in our education system over the past 5 years. And that term special educational needs and disabilities is also now becoming interchangeable with the whole concept of neurodiverse. Some people use the term neurodivergent, which is what it says in the dictionary, and that word means deviant, deviating from the norm. Well, I don't know about you, but as a man with ADHD, I don't consider myself to be deviant or deviating from the norm. If everybody's brain is different out of 7.5 billion people, then I'm not quite sure what normal is. And in truth, I prefer the term neurodiverse, as do many other people, but it's a matter of personal choice, how we identify. For me, the word neurodiverse says something positive. We don't refer to people of colour as racially divergent, do we? We don't refer to LGBTQ people as sexually divergent, but it's very much about what we as individuals, how we want to define ourselves and respect other people's choice about that. But fundamentally what it means is we are all different. Every one of us is unique. Our brains are unique, as well as our character, how we look, how we think. So neurodiversity is an evolutionary necessity. It's as essential to life on this planet as biodiversity. And we're only really now beginning to understand that actually, historically, we wanted everybody to be the same, haven't we? in order to belong, you've got to be like us. And in a way, we're a social species. We thrive in a social group. In our families, when we're born, we learn how to behave in the home. We learn how to say please and thank you. And we learn to show affection with our parents. We learn from other people. We thrive, and our brains develop through the learning that we have in interaction with other people. Even learning in school is a social process. It's not just about knowledge, is it? It's about what we value, the context we're in, understanding what we've learned from the past and how that might inform our thinking about the future. All of these things are so complex in terms of this amazing brain and nervous system we have, but we only understand a fraction of what our brains can do. And in a neurodiversity paradigm, what we're saying is not disordered, not errors of genetics, not less than, simply different. And that is exactly how the universe designed our DNA, which is something that we experience. Every single cell of our body is uniquely us, but is also impacted by the environment that we live in. And there is an evolutionary reason why we are all different. And fundamental to that is a genetic imperative in human species that are a social species, that the genetic imperative is relationship driven. We learn most effectively through social interaction with other people. We co-create, and that's why not one single human being on this planet is the same. There is something about who we are that needs to create relationships, and in intimate relationships, we procreate. We have children who are unique. They are like us, but they are not exactly a carbon copy of us. So difference is wonderful. And young people now are so much more embracing of diversity. When I was at school, there were hardly any children who were Black. There were certainly no children who were out and proud as LGBTQ. So let's just ask ourselves for a second, cast your mind back to puberty and adolescence for you. I know you're a parent now, but what was it like for you when you were young? What was your first crush, your first infatuation? And I don't know how many of you can remember what that was like, but it was overwhelming. And actually, things happen with your brain chemistry. It's flooded with dopamine, which is one of the neurotransmitters we know works differently with ADHD and autism, for example. Can also, too much dopamine can make you a bit clumsy. But it can also be very painful. Your ability to feel confident around the person who you have this crush on is gone. You are fearful of what other people might say, or you're fearful of rejection. Try and remember back at school about peer pressure, the pressure to have the latest fashion and a certain type of haircut, or like a certain type of music, or to have a boyfriend or a girlfriend, when often you probably didn't even want one, but there was this expectation, this peer pressure. And how many of you can remember the first time you fell in love? And how many of you was, how many of you was that experience one of unrequited love? And I'm sure for those of you that have been there, you will all be able to agree that there is no pain in the world quite like it, is there? And when you are young, you have no map that tells you this is how you deal with this situation. Because in school, the object of your affection will be sat next to you or sat in the same class. There is no way to avoid them. And the sense of rejection, particularly when other people find out that your love is not requited, can cause shame and embarrassment. You peek at yourself in the mirror to think, what's wrong with me? Am I not attractive enough? Am I not funny enough? Am I not popular enough? It can be a really, really scary experience for a lot of young people, charting their way through, um, adolescence. And if you think as well that really one of the most important things when you're a teenager is your friendship groups, isn't it? Your need to belong. We feel safe and protected in a social group. But if you've been a neurodiverse child who has perhaps been in a school where anybody with learning differences has been considered somehow less than, then your sense of isolation is already going to be there. If you're autistic or ADHD or dyslexic, you might already feel isolated, like you don't really belong in that school. That a lot of teachers perhaps think that it's only the special needs coordinator that's responsible for you. You might not really know or feel safe and valued. If you add that to then contemplating that this social conditioning that we have around the expectation of heterosexuality, then the fear of rejection and isolation can be paralyzing. And many young people mask, pretend to be something that they're not in order to feel safe and in order to belong. These young human beings of 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 years of age, it is a frightening time. It can be an exciting and wonderful time, but it can also be a time when they experience a lot of loneliness and distress. And for those of us who are old enough to be parents, you can say, well, when I was a kid, this is how it was for me. But actually, when we were children, the world was very, very different. 20 years ago, the world was very, very different. The schools we went to were very different. The culture was very different. What you've seen on the television and on the internet was very different. In fact, it didn't really exist, did it? We couldn't get on the internet until about 25 years ago. So how do you navigate your way through all of that, particularly if you're neurodiverse and you process information differently from everybody else? Is it any wonder so many young people experience anxiety or distress as they transition through from childhood to adolescence and early adulthood, trying to understand who am I, and this fundamental need that we all have as human beings to be known and understood and accepted by somebody else. It's the most amazing, beautiful, and empowering thing that we can experience, but it can also be a place where we are at our most vulnerable and where we can be hurt. And how we help our children navigate their way through this period in their lives and protect them and help them feel safe and hopefully model the kind of behavior that we want to see in them as responsible, considerate, kind, inspirational young people who respect others, who respect their environment, who, are passionate about social justice and who care about, what happens to other people. Young people now, I think, are much more embracing of diversity than they once were. But also, I think, a generation perhaps a little bit more troubled. And, I watched, in preparation for this particular webinar, I watched a series on Netflix called Sex Education. And I have to say, I was quite taken aback at some of it. Not because I'm approved by any sense of the word, but just about how open and comfortable young people are now talking about sex in a way that certainly my parents were not, and that I wasn't when I was young. So why do you think puberty and adolescence might be more difficult for neurodiverse children, and how can we support them? In what way do you think puberty and adolescence might be more difficult for your autistic child, your ADHD child, your dyslexic child, your Tourette's child. And how can we as parents explain what is safe, respectful, and appropriate behaviour when it comes to the expression of sexuality, in teenagers and young adults? Our responsibility as parents is to help them understand who they are, to know that they are loved, accepted, valued, and that we are always there for them to catch them when they fall, because fall they will, because learning is a trial and error process, and if we're not making mistakes, then we're certainly not trying. So, of course, they are going to make mistakes in relationships. There are plenty of us who are middle-aged who still make mistakes in relationships, and sometimes we can look back and say, well, it's a good job we were naive, because we probably would never have done anything when we were young, because we didn't realize how vulnerable we were. But mindful of the fact that we know a lot of ND children have a developmental delay. So we know that executive functioning skills delay is evident in at least half of all children with ADHD, and dyslexia and autism, and dyspraxia, in fact. So even though they might be 16 years of age, they might have the maturity, the emotional maturity of a 12 or 13-year-old. Well, what do you do when your body is going through this transition? You are now getting these urges, this need to want to feel intimate with another human being and to be held, but you don't have the inhibitory control or the ability to communicate in a sensitive, honest, and context-appropriate way. And context is a word you'll keep hearing from me, because context often defines what is and isn't appropriate. How we behave in the bedroom with our partners is a unique private context. How we behave in a school classroom is a completely different context, and there are rules and social mores in that classroom context. How we behave when we're out with a group of friends of a weekend is a different context. And when you're young, every day is full of firsts. You're learning something new every day about yourself, about other people, about the world. And today, we have young people who are absolutely bombarded with information from everywhere, from 24-hour television, smartphones, in school. We have, if you like, an abundance of information, and not all of it wise, not all of it helpful, not all of it context inappropriate. So what do? We have these young children who are now in adults' bodies, but still have the mind of a child, even though many teenagers certainly don't want to be referred to as a child, and this often fearless sense of expectation and aspiration of what their life is going to be like now that they're growing up, and soon they're going to be able to do what they want without their parents or their teachers telling them you can't do this and you can't do that. So understanding that emerging sexuality in children who are neurodiverse can be more difficult because of the developmental delay. Some children reach puberty earlier. Some children reach puberty much later. I was talking to a parent the other day whose daughter hadn't reached puberty, and she was 19 years of age. The thing is, we have, again, in our culture, don't we, this expectation that, well, you get to a certain age and you should be able to read X number of words. You get to a certain age and you should be able to understand and do this kind of exam in school. And you get to a certain age and you can vote, and you get to a certain age and you can drive, and you get to a certain age and you can get married. Well, we don't all grow up the same pace, and that is particularly true of ND children and young people. So we have to understand and meet our children and young people where they are. And whatever their chronological age, let's think about their emotional age and maturation. And while we can also admit that as adults, sometimes we don't act our age, we have to accept that growing up is a trial and error process. And the main rule of thumb is we treat other people with kindness and respect, always, in every context, everywhere we are, whatever the circumstances. So here's some of the evidence around why we know that children are increasingly embracing of diversity in our schools. So I know, for example, even with a lot of the young people that we work with, that when I was at school, nobody talked about this as that, didn't have autistic friends or ADHD friends. If you were different, you just didn't belong. Now, in our schools, there are lots of children who wear their neurodiversity with pride, which is wonderful and long overdue. We're beginning to see teachers now speak publicly about their neurodiversity. And we're also seeing a lot more young people speaking openly about their sexual identity. And that actually all these different acronyms, we've gone from, as gay when sort of I was first coming out as a young man in my late teens, to gay and lesbian, then gay, lesbian, bisexual, and gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, queer, asexual, and on it goes. Young people do not like to be put into boxes. And, I think it's wonderful, isn't it? You should never be afraid of disappointing anybody who wants to put you in a box. We are far too complex human beings to be defined by something, I think, when I was young, people used to often introduce, oh, this is Tony and he's gay. And I just think, why are you saying that? It's like, that's the only thing about me that matters. Or, this is Tony, he's ADHD, or this, he's autistic, or like these things, just completely define who we are when we're the sum of so much in so many life experiences. But fundamental to our maturing as young people transitioning into adulthood is we ask ourselves, who am I? Who am I? What do I believe in? What do I want to be? What do I aspire to be? What am I good at? We want to know ourselves, and we want other people to know who we are. And we seek out people who we think are like us. We want to belong to a social group. It's a very, very instinctive thing. But here's the thing. Even in any social group of friends, you're going to have children of different racial backgrounds, different sexual orientations, different neurotypes, different faiths. So even now in small social groups to which young people belong, there is this phenomenal diversity that didn't exist when I was at school. And even as adults, we ask ourselves, where do I belong? Who is my tribe? That doesn't mean to say that we don't mix or interact with people who are not like us, because everybody is like us by definition of the fact that they're human. That's what binds us all. That's what makes us fundamentally members of the human race. And human sexuality is a really broad spectrum. It's not just gay or straight. It's not binary. It's not black or white. It's not intelligent or not intelligent. It's not autistic and nothing else. We know that with autism, there is significant co-occurrence with ADHD. Some estimates, half of people with autistic, also ADHD. Over 40% of people with ADHD, also dyslexic. Neurodiversity is a spectrum. Human sexuality is a spectrum. And some researchers argue that that spectrum is fluid, that a lot of people, when they're young, may identify as bisexual, for example, but by the time they get to middle age, they have usually defined themselves as either gay or straight. But again, we're seeing more and more people maintain their sexual orientation as bisexual. So for some young people, identifying as asexual, which is absolutely fine as well, is young people who don't particularly feel sexual or sexually attracted to other people. Young people who define themselves as non-binary, they don't identify themselves as either male or female. Some young people who identify as lesbian, transgender, and queer. And then there's this new term around neurodiversity and LGBTQA, and that's neuroqueer, which is the latest one. There's also a lot of young people who are saying now, why are you even asking me the question, am I gay? It's like, why is that a question? It doesn't matter. My name is Chris. Why are you asking me if I'm gay or if I'm trans? This is my name. And while we all like to have labels to help us order the world, sometimes labels can be constraining. Sometimes labels can be a box that people try to put us in. And young people are much, much more resistant to being defined or constrained by a single label. And I applaud them for that. I think we all have something to learn from them. But here's some interesting data for all the parents. 16 to 24-year-olds are more likely to identify as LGBTQ plus in the UK than anybody older. If you look at that graph there, 7%. 7%. So that's about 1 in 17 people identify as LGBTQ among the 16 to 24-year age group. 1 in 17. That number diminishes a little bit. And I think that's probably because in our older generation, you've got a lot of people who were LGBTQ, but because of context, the time that we lived in, didn't feel that they were able to come out to be in same-sex relationships or in relationships with people with non-defined sexual orientations or genders. So if 1 in 17, 18 young people between the age of 16 and 24 identify as gay, then we know that about 1 in 17 young people in schools and sixth forms and universities are going to be identifying as LGBTQA. 1 in 17. Now, here's the interesting thing. When it comes to LGBTQ, double it. Autistic females are 3 times more likely to identify as lesbian. Autistic females are 4 times more likely to identify as bisexual. Autistic adults, 8 times more likely to identify as asexual. Autistic males are 3.5 times more likely to identify as bisexual. And adults with ADHD, in a survey that we did last year, over 18% of adults with ADHD identify as LGBTQA. That's 1 in 5 adults with ADHD. So if we've got 1 in 17 young people between the age of 16 and 24 identifying as LGBTQ, then it means if this data is correct, and we don't know yet because the research is still relatively young, the implications are that about 1 in 9 neurodiverse young people between the age of 16 and 24 identify as LGBTQA, 1 in 9. So for those of you who are parents of ND children, neurodiverse children, then there's a possibility that you're going to have a child who identifies as LGBTQA. So thinking about that, and also research that's telling us that 24% of gender diverse and transgender people are autistic, and that between 30 and 50% of transgender teens experience a lot of emotional distress resulting in self-harm. I can't imagine how confusing it must be to not identify with one gender or the other. And when I think about the discrimination and the isolation that people must feel when they're rejected and told that you don't belong here, you're not like us, for something that they are intrinsically, uniquely themselves, doesn't identify as male or female, gay or straight, that can be a very lonely place when, as a teenager, the most important thing to you, isn't it, is your friends and being popular and being liked and being valued and feeling that you are part of the group and that you are protected and safe as part of that social group. UK culture has been ahead of the curve in terms of our legal rights around LGBTQA, but remember, right up until the late 80s, it was still classed as a mental illness in the medical manuals. And think of some of the other words that were used to describe people who had ADHD or autism and dyslexia, dyspraxia in the 80s. Some horrible words were in the dictionary. But fear of not belonging to a social group is really something that can cause a great deal of mental distress and unhappiness in our children. And we all want our kids to be happy. That is all we want, isn't it? They're successful, they have a fantastic job, all of those things, yeah, wonderful, but more than anything else, we want them to be happy, because we know that whatever your job, whatever you do, whatever your skills, whatever your abilities, if you are happy, then as parents, that makes us feel happy. We know that you are well, that you're safe, that you've found your tribe, that you are being who you are and thriving and succeeding in the world. We know that for teenagers, this is a difficult time. Being different can feel isolating and lonely, because young people are always asking this question: who am I? Where do I belong? Who is my tribe? And this idea of be here, be you, belong, which is, there's a school that we work with closely called Whitefield Primary. It's in quite a deprived area of Merseyside, has won so many awards. It's such a vibrant, inclusive school with children from every faith and race, and different family types, with same-sex parents, racially mixed parents. It is just this beautiful melting pot of humanity. And as you walk in the school, not only do they have their umbrella display that celebrates all the neurodiverse learners in their school, but there is a neon lit sign that says, be here, be here, be you, belong. Sexuality plays a really important part in our identity. And for some people, as I said, it's a fluid process. We don't just wake up one morning and say, I'm gay, or I'm lesbian, or I'm trans, or I'm bisexual. It's something that emerges, isn't it? It's something that we become, and as we grow and as we learn throughout our adolescence. So that transition to adulthood is one where we begin to recognize that we are attracted to certain people, that we want to feel intimate with certain people. That is that sense of intimacy that's not just about the physical aspect of sex or orgasm, but it's actually something about being close to another human being in a very intimate way that makes us feel alive. When we're upset, when we're distressed, being hugged by another human being is one of the most calming, soothing things. It makes us feel safe. When we have happy relationships, everything about our life is much happier. Think about when you fell in love with your partner and you decided to make commitment for however long that you were together, and how energizing and beautiful that is, and how it just seems to radiate from you, and people can say, oh gosh, you look so happy together. There is something that just emanates from you. It is absolutely integral to who we are as human beings. This need to bond with a mate. But all of that is also about forming healthy and respectful relationships. And it's an essential part of our growing up. And for some of us, we'll have had several intimate physical relationships with people before we settle into a long-term relationship. I don't want to get into the morality here. I know that there are a lot of people who have multiple sexual partners, and certainly when they're young, the term play the field, which I'm never really quite sure what that means. It almost implies a carelessness, doesn't it, and a happy-go-lucky, but I don't think engaging in physical sexual relationships with anybody is necessarily something that we should do in a happy-go-lucky state of mind where we have no understanding of what consequences are, what the meaning of it is for you and the other person, because whatever the meaning is for you might not be the same for somebody else. So falling in love, certainly a crush, is going to happen to most of your children and young people from puberty onwards. That is how it is. And it can be acutely painful, and can also be the most joyful, wonderful thing in the world. And with young people, often, those relationships tend to be fairly short-lived. But there are some young people who stay together for quite a long time in an established, committed, and lasting relationship that is built on more than just physical attraction and physical intimacy. Key questions I get from parents all the time is, can I really understand my child's sexuality through my own neurotypical mindset? Because I'm not autistic, or I'm not ADHD, but my kid is, so I don't know what it's like for them. And it's a really good question, isn't it? If you're not autistic or ADHD, dyslexic, how could you possibly know? How you can guess, because there is a universal language here, isn't there, of love and physical intimacy, irrespective of your neurotype. And one parent said to me, I know my son, he might be 16 and he's got himself a girlfriend, but he's got the emotional maturity of a 12-year-old. But how am I going to help him understand consent? How am I going to help him understand that, how you negotiate sexual relationships is something that has to be articulated? And here's the thing, it might be legal to have a sexual relationship at 16, but are you really ready? And is the other person that you're going to be having a physical relationship with, are they ready? Are you going to be okay the next day? Are you coercing somebody to do something they don't want to, or pressure somebody, or is somebody coercing you? I know that I've had a lot of concerns from parents of autistic children who are very literal, who have a very literal understanding of the spoken word, and those parents are terrified about how vulnerable their children are in terms of coercion, and do everything they can to protect their children from things online where they might encounter people who will coerce them, because often online your age is not disclosed. And online, a lot of young people use avatars, so other people who are on these gaming groups and everything else don't necessarily know the age of the people who they're playing these interactive computer games with. We need to actually talk to our children about these issues. We need to talk about pornography, because a lot of children have access to pornography via their smartphone. So yes, you can change the settings, but I think it's important to understand that if you are going to do that, you actually have that conversation with your child, because for some of them, their friends are going to have access to pornography. And young people are curious, and they want to know what other people's bodies look like and what they do with them. It is part of who we are as human beings. It is not dirty. It is not wrong. It is natural. And it's not something that we want young people to feel ashamed about. So in terms of understanding that our children can be vulnerable and easily hurt, well, all children can. Neurotypical children can as well. So it is about, you need to have those conversations with your children, and it's never too early to start them. And you also need to talk with your partner, your friends, so that you don't feel embarrassed talking to your child about sex, about masturbation, which, is an integral part of puberty and adolescence. Young people need to understand this is. They need to understand the necessity for privacy in terms of how they explore and discover their bodies without shame or embarrassment. They need to know about contraception and the consequences of not using contraception in terms of sexually transmitted disease and, heaven forbid, unplanned pregnancies. Now, children are impulsive. Adults can be impulsive, excited, aroused, and adults who are in love with each other or infatuated with each other can be impulsive. Well, mix that with immaturity, developmental delay, ADHD, autism, it can be a minefield of hurt and vulnerability. And as parents, we need to be comfortable talking to it. So never too early to start those conversations. When it comes up on the television, talk about it, seize the moment and say, do you understand this? What would you have done in that situation? Did you think that these people were considering each, how each other felt? Bring it into everyday life. Don't wait until something happens and then tell your partner you need to go and have a chat with our David, or you need to go and have a chat with Jenny. You need to be having those conversations quite early on. You need to normalize it. You need to help children understand it's a natural part of being human, part of growing up, not something they should feel ashamed of. And what I would say as well is it's really important that your children trust you. And when I say trust you, I mean trust you not to make them feel ashamed of the mistakes that they make, not to feel ashamed of their body and these natural urges that they are going to have for physical intimacy. It is nothing to be ashamed of. And if they make a mistake and say, Mom, Dad, I've got my, and don't say I told you so, they're going to feel tough enough. Go back to when you were pubescent or an adolescent. What did you need from your mum and dad? Or your two dads, or your two moms? What did you need? Be the parent that you needed to your children now. Puberty and adolescence is difficult enough. Navigating relationships is potential minefield of hate and vulnerability and rejection. They need to know you've got their back. They need to know you understand. They need to know that you are there and that they can sit and cry on your shoulder when they've had their heart broken because the other person that they've got this crush on or they think they're in love with doesn't feel the same way about them. And that to them is like the world coming to an end. It's really important that you can have that conversation. And it's important that you say to them, you can tell me anything. I never want you to be afraid to tell me about this. And I know that this is a private thing for you and you don't want to tell me the ins and outs of your sex life or your fantasies, but please, if there's anything that you want to explain to you, ask me. Or find, as I say, an opportune time. I say that program on Netflix called Sex Education. There was some other really quite good balanced things on television media that help inform young people about having healthy and respectful approach to sexual intimacy and to understand how we treat other people in that context. Puberty and adolescence are difficult enough. If you've got a child who also has what's called in medical terminology low intellectual capacity, i.e. a low IQ, then this is a different situation as well. And there's been a lot of debate, hasn't there, about, well, should young adults who have LD, a learning disability, be allowed to have physical intimate relationships? It is a fundamental human need and a fundamental human right. And if you have any concerns about your child's capacity to make informed, responsible decisions about sexual behaviour, talk with them and talk with an expert who will help your child grow, because there are lots of adults who have got learning disabilities who live very happy, fulfilled and rich relationships. They are not lonely, they are not isolated, and whatever their vulnerabilities are, they are entitled to have companionship and indeed physical relationship as well if they want to. The issues of contraception, of course, and having a family are things that need to be, I think, assessed and discussed on a case-by-case basis. But there should be no reason why, if a couple are able to care for a child, why they should not be given that human right to have a family. But I appreciate that that is a difficult area in the sense that we know that there are different levels of vulnerability, and what we call, cognitive competency to make decisions that are in your own best interests and in the best interests of others. And that is sometimes, used in a legal context with regards to young adults with learning disabilities entering into physical, intimate relationships, marriages, and indeed, if the question arises, whether they choose to have a family. The research suggests, though, that while we know that a lot of young people with learning disabilities do have relationships, research is telling us that they tend not to have enough information or accurate information about sexual health, about physical intimacy and the very act of sex and its implications, both from an emotional point of view and from a legal point of view in terms of understanding consent, etc. These are things that, for parents of children, young adults with learning disability, you need to think about very carefully. Again, this is a clear one. No means no. Consent is crucial, and any abuse, humiliation, whether it's taking photographs, sharing photographs, is not acceptable. Certainly, you have to impress upon your children, but having photographs of other young people, if they are under the age of 16, is illegal. It is against the law. And similarly, they should never share photographs of themselves, intimate photographs with anybody, because they could potentially end up anywhere on the internet. So really, really important that children understand how dangerous it can be sharing photographic images on phones of other young people naked. So here's the guidance for parents. Talk and listen. Sex is perfectly normal. It's a fundamental part of who we are and how we relate to people. It is a beautiful, amazing, healing, wonderful, fun thing, in an intimate relationship, but it can be all of those things even in fleeting relationships. Who are we to cast judgment on people who may have a lot of sexual partners? That is their choice. But for you, it is important that you're able to be comfortable talking about sex with your young children who are becoming young adults. And if you're embarrassed and you're not comfortable with it, then say so. Say to your son, I'm not comfortable about this. I feel a bit embarrassed. I'm not sure I even understand kind of language that your generation uses. Talk about your values. Talk about the kind of values that you want them to have about how they treat other people. How they don't humiliate other people or hate other people, about understanding how vulnerable other people are when they are engaged in a relationship, how vulnerable somebody is who loves you if you don't necessarily feel the same way back, as often happens with teenagers. That they are to treat that admiration, affection, crush that somebody else might have on them with tenderness and sensitivity and respect, because one day the shoe is going to be on the other foot and it's going to be them who's in that situation. Listen to them, be honest, be direct, try not to be too metaphorical in your language or nuanced. Be direct, say it how it is, but understand their point of view even if you don't agree with it. Place a big emphasis on their well-being, their sexual health. And as I say, when the opportunity arises to talk about sex, do so, but do it in a very kind of comfortable way, not like it's a big secret, not like it's something shameful. I remember my mother ripping over herself and going flying in the living room, rushing to turn the television off because there was a bare breast on this television screen. It was a very, very different kind of culture that I grew up in. And it's really, I think, a wonderful thing that we now live in a time where young people do not feel that sense of fear or shame or ignorance. But with that also must come an understanding about their need to be respectful and kind in terms of their treatment of others and themselves. First things first, relationship or not, you need to have the conversation with them about things like masturbation, about conception, about sexual health, about what's happening to their bodies. I have sort of met in so many young women who didn't even know what menstruation was until they'd had their first period and were terrified and really didn't know what was happening to them. We should not, in this day and age, leave children to wonder what on earth is happening to their bodies without giving them an understanding of that at the very start of that process. There are some good resources, of course, on the internet. Check out what other parents doing that you trust. Find out what's appropriate from the Department for Education website in terms of sex education in schools. But more than anything else, talk to your children, listen to them, understand their journey and how they are trying to understand themselves, what's happening to their bodies, the feelings and urges and the desires that they're getting. Tell them that it's okay, that this is part of growing up, that it's a very beautiful thing. It's also at times a very challenging thing and a worrying thing, and that you love them for who they are, whatever their sexual identity, whatever their sexual orientation. It matters not whether they are gay or straight or bi or trans, whatever it might be. They are a human being trying to navigate their way through the sometimes storms of adolescence into adulthood, and in the process, we hope, turning out to be very decent, kind human beings who will eventually meet somebody who changes their life, who they want to make a commitment to for a very long time, maybe perhaps who they want to have children with and become parents with. They're going to need all the help, love, understanding, compassion, forgiveness that you can possibly give them as parents. We know how tough it is. They don't know yet. They really need our understanding, our support, and we need to be informed. Thanks very much, everybody.